So this is an opportunity. We do have a roving mic as well if people do have a question of any of the speakers. I mean, is mobility as a service real? Are you just happy just continuing to run public transport services and be part of something that might happen or might not happen? I guess they're the questions for you. I think one of the core from all of the presentations was that at the spine of the transport network will continue to be mass transit, which will be bus and train services. And in regional areas and lower volume markets, it'll be something different as well. But it's certainly part of change that's occurring, and my gut feel is that these things will evolve into something that will be value added to public transport and mass transit. But this is an opportunity. We will be finishing at 4:30, but this is an opportunity for you to ask any questions or express a view. But I might ask the first question. I did send out a series of questions. The last one was, am I a knob? But no one answered it. I just put it on there to make sure they read it. Do you want to answer it, Graham?
Well, I think everybody knew what the answer was.
So, mobility as a service, simple question. Should transit be at the core, at the spine of mobility as a service? Is that where it needs to be? And whoever wants to answer can go.
I'm happy to give it a go. So I think that it probably depends on who you ask. So some people would be quite happy for transit not to be part of the spine, but then we're going to have some pretty different outcomes from a community perspective. And we've heard about the Infrastructure Australia talk about the fears of congestion hitting our roads. So I think if we're going to get the right outcomes for the community, we need to make sure that public transport steps up and transit is an integral part of new services that might emerge.
No, I'm going to jump into something else. I mean, my view is, and I think it's pretty common, that no matter how we look at government outcomes in the context of our transport network, public transport is going to be at the core of mass transit. I think we can all agree on that, which means that everyone in this room should feel safe if you're a city operator, but what it might mean for regional operations, for lower volume markets, actually might be interesting, and maybe the best opportunity for bus operators to become the regional Uber. John King, any thoughts about the small and low volume stuff and maybe some of your on-demand transport experience that you can share?
Yeah, and there's quite a lot. In the sense of mass transit, and we proved this in Wollongong, that if you take 8 vehicles that do a free service, and the government can't get their head around this, carries more than the whole network of 230 buses. So, it's about where you really want to sit with it. Putting an on-demand on the first mile, last mile is a high-cost operation. There's no doubt about that. And I think in the rural and regional world is that when you've got low patronage, your on-demand might work a little bit cheaper in that sense because you're only moving when you need to move. So you've got to find what your efficient model would be to actually come up with the right result and become value for money, but value for the community that's going to actually want to use the service. And then you get it to a pinch point where mass transit has to come back in. Once you wind out, it's very hard to get government or convince government to move back into it.
Any other views on the sort of regional transport landscape when it comes to mobility as a service?
Well, I look at this as a very simple way. These systems give you choice amongst options, and if you live in an area where there's no choice, they're not going to be terribly useful. Isn't it pretty obvious? So I do think better information is good, but I don't know how it's going to work if there's no choice. I think it's all a little bit too early for us to know, really. I do think we've already had some mention there of on-demand transport. I mean, my experience is those things are actually quite good for shallow, weak markets, but they involve a lot of subsidy. And I think the problem with those sorts of services is we've expected them to be highly profitable, and they're not. That doesn't mean to say they're not good. I think they're actually quite good in low volume markets. And if we thought of them that way, we wouldn't be so critical of them, I think.
Yeah.
Yes, if I can add to this. I think a lot of people, a lot of operators in rural and regional contexts, and I think even metropolitan in outer metro and more marginal areas, they already want to use something other than a full-size fixed bus running fixed routes, but they can't because of the existing contract regime. They have to run a full bus. They can't run a taxi. They can't outsource it to Uber or someone else, where you also have the saving of a much lower labour cost, for instance. But on that point about different geographic contexts and what you put there in terms of from different temporal efficiencies, what kind of capacity of each mode, I think there's two philosophies to this. You can admit that public transport's not going to work there, and then you just run these other things, and then that might be a downward decay in terms of urban form going forward, leading to more sprawl, and the public transport's never going to work in that case. Or you can work with integrated land use and get the densities up and help support public transport and make it a positive feedback cycle the other way. So I don't know if it's fair to say it's an admission of failure, but maybe I'm sure it does have its context and markets, but different ways of looking at it.
Barry, it was interesting listening to Martin, who was basically presented the New Zealand Transport Agency's view, and that's the government's view, that public transport's at the centre of those apps and what they're doing, the Choice app, etc., and that they've got this interesting mix of subsidised transport and these commercial services all swirling around, but at the core of what they're trying to do is make public transport more popular, or as a key driver to deliver policy outcomes. What kind of engagement have you had, and your particular views of where that's heading?
Well, I think it's very early days. Martin mentioned the two apps that they've developed, but they're very small trials, and I'm not sure how many users they've got of those apps, and it's probably a little bit early to understand what it's doing in terms of driving behaviours. I think there's huge opportunity, and a lot of the effort's gone into getting all the data feeds and getting all the information there to create the opportunities. And I think the next 12 months will be really interesting, see how it all develops.
Yeah. So what about the panel in the context? I mean, I'm just interested in what I'd probably call the sweet spot between subsidy and commercial services, and what the government's role is in mobility as a service, because some government politicians or some politicians seem to think there's a magic pudding out there that's going to somehow reduce the overall cost of public transport. We'll have these magic solutions that people aren't going to pay for, or someone's going to pay for, or the bus operator's going to do something for free. I mean, I'm just interested in what the government's role is in this sort of changing dynamic, if it is a changing dynamic, or is it just a political opportunity to save money?
Well, yeah, great question. There's the worry. I mean, the situation's the same as it always has been. There's a reason for subsidy. There's good benefits, and as long as we follow that, that's fantastic. You know, that's why, you know, congestion relief, social issues, environmental benefits, and that's true no matter what the technology is. But there is always pressure from governments to reduce subsidies, and there's a danger new ideas will be used to push that. So what we need is a fantastic bus industry confederation to tell the truth, and that's what's happening.
I think we need to make sure that we still hang on to subsidies where we need them. And I think Martin had some interesting examples in New Zealand. We're looking at technology to have more dynamic subsidies so that we can actually target the subsidies to exactly where they're needed. You know, I think the bus operators need to have visibility of that so that you're still operating commercially and effectively. But there can be use of technology to perhaps change where the subsidies are to get better outcomes for the community, but to then still support overall strong outcomes.
Are there any questions from the floor at the moment? I can't see anybody, so I'll have to yell. There's a big light in my face.
Michael, if I may, I was also interested to hear from operators. We were talking about regional opportunities for MaaS, and I think one of the things that perhaps hasn't been touched on, whether it's relevant or not, is the community that we can get behind these services. Perhaps in a rural centre there may be a greater propensity to get behind a local service that might, with new technology, might be able to provide an enhanced service and be able to get the word out more quickly compared to in a city or metropolitan environment. Whether others think that?
So I can answer that. We're trialling that in a couple of areas that we operate. getting the community behind you is one thing. It's once you get it to a pinch point is when the community loses interest because government don't want to invest anymore. So it's one of those things, it's a two-edged sword. So you get it to a point where mass transit then needs to come in and do some work to it. Once you get the subsidy side of things happening, then you've got to build that up. And it doesn't actually pay for itself until you get total mass transit. You get that pinch point between the two modes as such. So it becomes very difficult.
Victim of its own success.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
That's the only thing they ever say. It's a victim of its own success.
So I was interested in Yale when you got to your bus contract stuff and the sort of work that you're doing in that space that's looking at what might the opportunities be for a bus operator to be more than just a bus operator. I mean, I guess the reality is the contract's currently restrictive. They tell you what kind of bus you've got to have, where you can drive it and what time you can drive it, and a range of factors. So in fact, the existing bus contracts remove, in some respects, your entrepreneurial capacity as a business. And John, you may have a view on this. What kind of things are happening in New Zealand, for example, with bus operators and your existing contractual arrangements and the work that Martin's doing? And John, what's your feel for how the on-demand stuff's sort of been developed, even though they're pilots and they might actually see some contracts morph out of that are quite good for some of the successful models, successful trials? And views about how we actually get some flexibility, if that's the right word, into contractual arrangements to give operators an opportunity?
Our biggest problem is the inflexible structure of the contracts. And I mean, to move one route service by 1 hour or even 5 minutes is restrictive because it's held by the bureaucracy. And that's not a downside to the bureaucracy, but there's a budgetary call from government. That's where our industry's got to start rallying harder to actually come up with a better solution of them not trying to hold the purse string so much, but as an industry coming up with a solution to actually how we can manipulate the contracts. We've got to get the trust back into it, and Matt and I in New South Wales work very hard on that process of trying to come up with a solution, not just keep taking the money, but be more flexible, and we'll give you some outcomes to show value for money and to give the community back what they want. That gives government trust in our industry again to actually come up with a solution to say, let's trust them, let's let them go, remove some of the restraints.
Barry, has there been any real discussion with your association or the bus operators about their existing contracts and the mobility as a service type stuff that's going on, or is it?
No, I think we've got exactly the same problem that John alludes to, is that the contracts are too inflexible, and trying to get change is often difficult and time consuming.
Yeah. And Yale, the work you're doing, what's the next steps in that contract? I mean, it's sort of looking outward at stuff that currently exists with some ideas from an academic perspective.
As I said, I think there's, all these, there's a tsunami happening that are all these newcomers in the mobility market, and there's huge capital raisings that are happening, led by these big players like SoftBank, for instance. But bus operators have to reinvent themselves to be multimodal mobility operators in the future, and operating in partnership with other specialized businesses to deliver these. I think we talk about the inflexibility in the Australian context. In New South Wales, I know there's a lot of interest in the future of bus contracts, and there's been so much reform happening, and now there's the MaaS Innovation Challenge where they're trying to procure, although that is in a separate context. But there's a lot of positives, I think, from the contracting regime locally as well. So when we look overseas, especially in economically deregulated market, and we can talk about MaaS Global, for instance, which is one of the major players in terms of deploying MaaS, and they've really struggled in there. They first started in Helsinki, and now they're trying to move into, or they already have, although it's a very limited deployment in the West Midlands region in the UK, around Birmingham. They've really struggled so much in those kind of market settings where there's en-route competition, where there's different branding, there's different ticketing systems. It's a reason why they've struggled so much with deploying smart cards, for instance, because your small players, because the big, it's kind of an unhealthy kind of thing happening. The small players will be on an even playing field with the large players, and the large players don't like that, for instance. So I think we certainly have a lot of opportunities here in spite of some of those challenges that was outlined.
So, my reading of the Helsinki stuff, and I'm just be interested in John's view and operators, but MaaS is really about moving from a latent demand approach to services to an actual demand service to delivery. So you're actually aligning a customer with a mode to do something, which might be a bus. But I've forgotten what I was going to ask.
Well, I'll finish off
Finish
for
off
you.
with you?
That's
Yeah.
right.
Thanks, John.
But we are trying to do that in New South Wales, and we're trying to do it in Queensland as well. I mean, it's something that you've got to come up with something that's innovative for the community that the government's going to take notice of. But in New South Wales is a good point. They did take notice of some of the on-demand stuff that we spoke about. But it's not just on-demand in the sense of door-to-door or door-to-mode or door to railway stations or whatever you want. It's about how you actually mobilise your communities to get out of the car. We see so many slides up there about parking behind each other, and we're going to keep seeing that. We'll see it forever and a day. I'm sure my great-grandkids are going to say it. Bear in mind, my eldest grandson's 14, so we don't want that yet. But I think we're always going to have that problem. How do you actually convince it? I might be able to answer this. How do you convince the communities to get out of their cars and get back into transport? Get trust in us that we can actually deliver what we need to deliver. The biggest problem we've got with that is government wanting to reinvest and haven't got the tenacity to go forward to actually block off some lanes and stop the cars from going into cities like they did in London. And do you deregulate the market in an overall sense like they do in Europe and London, where you can go and buy 10 buses and run over the top of timetables as long as you can perform and be financial? At the end of the day, you'll do okay. But we don't have in our communities, I don't believe, the trust that we've been trying to develop over the last 100 years in transport.
I remember what I was going to ask.
Can I? Oh.
Yes.
I just wanted to add to that. Yeah, it's easy to get frustrated with the way we are and the intractable politics we have in our societies. But the great thing is that we're changing. And, by 2050, Melbourne's going to be the size of London is today. And Sydney will have got there before us. And that means that we need all that infrastructure, to try and be a mega city. So, that's never going to work with the car. And I think at the heart, particularly people in Sydney, they know that now. So I think we have a job now is to really show the politicians that we now need to do this. And I think increasingly it's happening. And inner city areas, it's where it's starting the most because we're very European now in the central areas. And that's where we're getting these green parties coming in, being elected. The residents know that it's disaster out there. They've got to have an alternative system. And increasingly this is growing out into the outer suburbs. So I think there's a great positive there, but we do need to get our arguments together to bring these people along. But I think, and we also have to have a bit of a longer term view of change. If we're all expecting change by next year, guys, we're going to be disappointed. But 5 years, a lot has happened in the last 5 years. And I think the next 5 will be even better.
Yeah, no, I actually struggle between the political visionary who wants to stand in front of the autonomous bus, which isn't really a bus, versus the sort of academic institutional research that's being undertaken that's showing that we've got these massive challenges with population growth, massive challenges with climate change, massive challenges with social inclusion, which all argue that public transport has to be higher on the agenda, but have this sort of dynamic that seems to be politically driven and in some senses possibly, as Graham said, by the technology people who are, talk it up and raise the expectations that something's going to change very quickly. So I think we're on the right track in the context of where government is. It's just a matter of probably keeping some sense in the discussion. So what will the mobility marketplace look like in a decade then?
I think we're going to see something that looks pretty different to what we've got today. We'll still have traditional transit, but we'll probably see, we might see some real blurrings of lines between what's public and what's private. because there'll be so many more opportunities for private operators to connect directly with the consumer. So I think we need to be looking out for how that might play out. So that'll be different. We'll see, increased levels of automation. We won't be seeing full autonomy driving in all places, in all locations. I think our cities are still too complex for that. And we've got, I think, a more cautious approach in Australia than what we're seeing in the US to the deployment of some of that highly automated vehicles as well. So we'll see some pretty different landscapes. So it's going to be an exciting ride over the next 10 years. So it's a real opportunity during that change to really position the bus industry in the right niche and to be offering a really attractive service and be looking in that what a consumer's really looking for.
Can I have a go? All right. I'm a bit thrown by the word mobility marketplace. It's a fancy-dancy word. I don't know what it is, but I don't know what transport is because that's what we do. All right, in 10 years. So Melbourne, Sydney, all the big cities, we're going to have a couple of extra million people each in them, okay? So there's going to be a huge need for efficiency. 10 years, we're all going to be on roads. We're not going to change the car fleet. A lot of people will be driving still. We'll be electric. I think that's going to be increasingly taking over. So one truth about transport infrastructure is it doesn't change much. Although we might have smart ways of looking at information technology, the road infrastructure, the railways, they're not going to change a lot in 10 years. 1%, 2%, 3% of the network might change. So I think it might be an awfully lot like today, to be honest. Our mode shares will be a bit higher. The case will be a bit stronger.
What about in New Zealand, Barry? It would look exactly the same.
I'm just thinking that one of the things you touched on before was around what's the role of the government. And I think there's a key role there to make sure that the regulatory environment is even-handed and doesn't favour one particular sort of operator over another, unless there's actually a public good case for that. And I'm not confident that... I think Uber's a really good example where taxis were caught napping, but they were pretty much unable to respond because they were highly regulated. And Uber came and ignored the regulations in some environments and got away with it. And in New Zealand's case, actually got the government to change the regulations in order to accommodate them, and fairly well decimated the taxi industry. And the one thing about disruption is it's unpredictable. You can see things coming and you can see what's around the corner, but exactly the way it evolves is often unpredictable, and trying to predict the future is always fraught.
So Martin McMullen raised the issue of road user charges, which was interesting. I mean, they've got a pretty effective user charging system in place in New Zealand, but if we all believe we're going to be electric soon and we're not using diesel and we're not collecting the excise, and so government revenues are going down, where does the money come from? I mean, if this mobility as a service is a reality, then is it really how much you charge for an inefficient vehicle versus an efficient vehicle, like a bus full of passengers versus a single-use car? Graham, Gail, charging, how is it?
Well, I think we all know the arguments, and many people agree it's a good idea, but politically it's hard to do. We are facing, within 10 years, because of electrification, eroding of the financial base for maintaining roads through the taxation system of fuel taxes. That will go, and we'll have to find a new way of getting money. That could be a spur for that. We actually don't know that one. Also, I'm not too sure how much of a difference it's going to make, to be frank. It is more logical way of handling our money, and it could take some people out of who are driving and get to pay their costs of doing that. But I'm not too sure it's going to revolutionise the world, frankly. So it's a big question mark still, isn't it?
So you don't really actually see charging, if it's used effectively, to change travel behaviour?
I think it'll be helpful, but what's going to happen is our cities are just going to get hugely congested. because we're not building the infrastructure we need. We're going to have, 3 million more people in Melbourne. I don't know where we're going to put them. And we'll have no choice but to have them run efficiently around the system. And that'll have to be in, railways or the reserve rights of way on roads. Not a lot of choice. I don't know if road user charging is going to solve that problem for us. It'll certainly get us more money.
Yep. So
Michael, if parking companies around Australia are the only ones making money, is that not something that we should be looking at? Well, they're talking about parking at hospitals and parking everywhere.
Well, if you look at Macquarie Bank, they make more money out of parking than they do out of landing aeroplanes at airports. But look, it's one of our things. The more convenient you make it for the car in the cities, the more you're going to keep the cars in the cities. We've just got to come up with a solution and get the trust in the community back into coming and travelling on transport. And if you look at what we were doing even 10 years ago with our fleets to what we are today, we're not selling the message well enough in our industry, and we need to start to do that.
I guess the question, when you look at mobility as a service, is it's moving to a world where the car is not essential and you actually have other options so those vehicles don't actually park. So in the context of this discussion, there's an interesting debate about parking, but I think you're right, parking currently is a significant factor that works against greater transit usage, and it's an area we need to talk about. Though if you looked in the capital cities these days, the price of parking is really limiting people's capacity to pay, and they are actually using transit in a lot of senses, but certainly in regional and smaller cities it's an issue that needs to be continually focused upon. Though some of the smart technology, which I know Susan would be aware of, is actually some of the smart technology that relates to more efficient identification of parking spots and not people driving around and around looking for one, and actually minimising the congestion that relates from that kind of thing.
Yeah, I was interested in Martin's view again, though, that the last thing he wants is to give you a parking spot when you arrive in the city, because that encourages you to drive. But there are other technologies around that support the transit sector as well. So you've heard discussions recently around potentially dynamic bus lanes. So where there's the community's pushing against having a new bus lane installed, well, we could make it live so that as the bus comes through, the cars are having to get out of the way to make way for the buses and things like that. So I think more and more we'll see increased connectivity on our road networks. They may look quite similar, but we'll see challenges to try and use technology to look at overcoming some of the shortcomings of the physical infrastructure, and to get better use and to enable the buses that are full of people, give them a green light through, and encouraging the cars to get out of the road.
One of my concerns is that a lot of this is eye candy, and everybody's frustrated by how inefficient cities work, and they like to blame the existing providers of transport. Hey, you guys aren't doing a good job. Let's get this new stuff in. And it's often not proven, and it's the hype that drives everything. And I feel like we're looking for imaginary fairy solutions that are not real. And we need to rebase everybody on the reality of cities, the fact that you need to carry mass amounts of people in mass vehicles. And I do feel that it's eye candy.
Yeah. What's your view? I mean, okay, yeah.
Add to that. No, I totally agree with that. It's people think it's all a technological problem or it's a engineering problem. It's a geometric problem at the end of the day. It's a mathematical issue. Cities are dense urban environments, and you have to move a lot of people in a small amount of space. And on the other question, on the parking and the 10-year vision, right? I don't think it will be too different, but with all these technologies coming online, I think travel time will increase or the population increase. But one thing that might be better is travel time certainty in terms of the variance just through information and everything there. And on the road user charge, one of the big, it's been talked about since the 60s, and all the places that have put it in, London, Stockholm, Singapore, they're all these inefficient cordon systems. It's not network efficient. One of the major opportunities for MaaS is you can actually hide it to the end user. People can't see it anymore. If they don't know about it, because it's an input in that package price from a clearinghouse mechanism. If we have the correct regulatory institutional overlay in place, then maybe it can be a lot more politically palpable. And on the parking, that's just a vision there. I'm not sure I see it happening, even though I can see a vision on that. I think the MaaS in the transition period, especially in places like Australia, will be moving people away from perhaps a second car ownership. And then if they're accessing that through MaaS, then maybe parking can be incorporated for there can be a provision for having an existing car, and parking can be put into that. And and then there can be a lot of behavioural shifting mechanisms in terms of the pricing related to that.
Yeah. So I might just quickly move on to autonomous vehicles. I tend to be on Professor Curry's side of the discussion about autonomous vehicles. I just don't think it's actually going to be a reality, particularly in the context of shared traffic currently and down the track. I don't think that people are actually going to give up their personal autonomy to be driven around by an autonomous vehicle. That, you know, and how much fun would the Bathurst 1000 be with driverless cars, or Recco not being able to take his V8 for a spin, or whatever it might be? I just think there's some actual human factors there that make it really not a reality. But an area I think autonomy actually probably is a reality and is in our industry. But buses actually on dedicated infrastructure are probably the first cab off the rank that can deliver some really big benefits. And in effect, I've been arguing with some politicians of late, and I'll be interested in the panel's view to wrap this up, that is this the last generation, the one we're in right now, the last generation of major fixed infrastructure investment into light and heavy rail, once we have these mass transit rail corridors done and dusted that we're currently building, is dedicated corridors that are operated on by autonomous vehicles that are effectively platooning carriages like a train, that can actually act independently altogether, that can service suburbs. Is that where autonomy actually may be the first cab off the rank?
Well,
Autonomy is here. We do it every day in our cars, and I think there's two aspects of it. The first aspect that you spoke about was infrastructure, and unfortunately in our world we have a very small political cycle, so no one's going to sit down and invest any time and effort into it unless private enterprise come up and invest in it themselves. Unfortunately, we are so over-governed, we're never going to get that. Recently I was in China and I was on an autonomous large 12.2 metre bus driving through a factory, and it was doing everything it should have done. Forklifts were driving out, people were coming across. It actually works. Are we ready for it? We're not. As in a tourist trade, if you look at the one that's operating in Perth, we've all been on it probably. You go for a little run down there and it's a novelty, but it's not going to work in day-to-day society unless government want to invest in that process. What I do see on autonomy though is that our industry can benefit from the safety aspects of autonomy, and we really need to start investing in that. And it's an investment. We have 4 vehicles running on our long distance between the New South Wales border and Cairns, and we're seeing the benefits coming through already on fatigue, driver safety, passenger safety. So there is a line we've got to draw. We can't say that we're going to put full fleets of autonomous buses into a network unless government are going to invest big money to keep them separated. Because you saw the slides up there where cars got confused in intersections and sliding in and sliding out, because that's what it's going to do. And quite honestly, when they stop, and you have to have intervention to get them going again. So I don't see we're going to see the autonomous vehicle total unless we've got infrastructure, but I do see that there's a benefit for our industry, and we must sell this to get some autonomous infrastructure into our vehicles. And if government don't want to invest in it, I think as an industry we do, because we can get a return on the investment.
Yeah, I sort of see the Brisbane busways as a classic example of where autonomous buses can operate completely independently of shared traffic and provide some interesting benefits that may need to have a safety supervisor on it when it goes off the busway, so someone can take over the driving. But there's an interim period in there, and if you're going to protect a corridor to put a light rail track down or a heavy rail track, why wouldn't you protect the corridor and put a autonomous electric bus down it that can do a variety of other more flexible things?
So, I mean, I think the challenge for the bus side is speed, because the problem is it has to deal with the environment, it has to perceive in a safe way, and the compromise is always going to be cutting down the speed. And so at the moment, the autonomous vehicles we have, the Navias, Easy Miles, they're tiny, they're very low capacity, very, very slow, and there have to be that. So I work with the Land Transport Authority of Singapore. They've got lots of this. They're really trying to encourage it. But what they really want to do is get buses to work with this. And that is a very big challenge in streets. What you've just said there, the Brisbane Busway, is a segregated right-of-way. And of course, where do these things work efficiently? In railways, underground, entirely separated. So I think we'll get wins there, but the street is a different problem. And I think we will always be challenged with getting to any reasonable speed. I think we can handle the scale problem. Currently, you need 3 small, extremely expensive Navias to replace a bus. Doesn't make any sense, really. But in future, I think we can get those vehicles bigger. But the speed challenge, safety challenge is going to be the big one, I think.
Some of the thinking in the autonomous vehicle space in light vehicles is that you might be able to have a vehicle that can drive autonomously on certain roads in certain conditions. So maybe on highway driving, you'll get onto the road, you'll have mapped in your GPS where you're going to go. Once you get onto the motorway, the car says, right, I'm ready to take over, I can take the lead here, and it'll then prompt you to take over as you're getting to the exit. That our city areas and the areas where most of our buses are operating in are actually too complex to be driven autonomously on a day-to-day basis at speed. But maybe it's some of those longer corridors where we could look at some autonomous type driving for buses, where we're on the corridors that are fully mapped and have that level of integration, and freeing up the driver to do other sorts of support services on the bus or something like that.
Okay. Well, I might wrap it up there. Thank you to the panel. And thank you to John King, who as everyone probably knows Kingy, but Premier Transport Group, but also the President of Bus New South Wales, who had no idea I was going to put him on the spot, so I appreciate you coming up. Kingy, we don't usually get caught out anyway. You tend to know what you're talking about, I've found. Well, they do. But can you put your hands together for the panel? Thanks, mate.